I'm Margot Sagel, and I'm really pleased to welcome you to Watchung Booksellers Evening with the Authors. Tonight, we're honored to host Neal Thompson, who's going to be talking about his book, The First Kennedys, The Humble Roots of an American Dynasty. And he's going to be in conversation with New York Times journalist and author Kate Zernike. And before I bring them on and introduce them, I just want to go over our Crowdcast format. For those of you who may not be familiar with it, there's a chat on the side where we love to hear from you if you're watching us, where you're from, if you want to give a shout out to Neal or Kate or me, and let us know where you're from. It's always exciting to see where people are. At the bottom, right, sorry. There's the Ask the Question button. Anytime during the conversation, if you have a question for Neal, you can put it in there, enter it in. And if you see a question that's similar to yours, you can just vote on that, and that'll bring the question up to the forefront. And most importantly, we have just below us here, we have the green buy button, which brings you to Watchung Booksellers, where you can purchase a copy of the First Kennedys signed. Neal thankfully came by the bookstore on Monday. We had a great time meeting him and talking to him, and he signed copies, so they're all ready for you. You can order online or come by the bookstore. And I think that's it. So now I would like to welcome Neal and Kate.
Am I there? Uh-oh.
Neal, you're there. Hi, Neal.
Oh, good.
And there's Kate.
We did it.
Thank you both so much for making the time to be with us tonight to talk about Neal's book. I just want to give read your bios because they're so fascinating, your backgrounds. Neal Thompson is a journalist and the author of 5 highly acclaimed books, including A Curious Man, Driving with the Devil, and the fatherhood and skateboarding memoir, Kickflip Boys. He has written for the New York Times, the Washington Post, Esquire, Outside, Oprah.com, and more. And he's taught creative nonfiction at Hugo House and the Great Smokies Writing Program. And he now lives in Seattle with his family, but he used to be in Montclair, and we were his local indie. So it's great to have him back. And Kate Zernike has been a reporter for the New York Times since 2000, where she was a member of the team that won the 2002 Pulitzer Prize for explanatory reporting. She previously was a reporter for the Boston Globe, and she's the author of Boiling Mad, Behind the Lines in Tea Party America. That was published in 2010. And we're expecting a new book from Kate, The Exceptions, 16 Women, MIT, and the Fight for Equality in Science. And that'll be published by Scribner early next year. And stay tuned because we'll be able to welcome Kate back then. But tonight, it's all about the First Kennedys. And thank you so much, both of you, for being here and talking to us about it. And I'll see you afterwards.
Anyway, welcome, Neal. Thanks for being in Montclair. We really appreciate it. Welcome back.
Thank you, Kate.
I love this book. I thought it was so fascinating, having been a reporter in Boston and followed the Kennedys, and I learned so much I didn't know. And I have to say, I couldn't help but think you write so beautifully about immigration from Ireland, and I was reading it and just thinking about, I couldn't help but think about Ukraine and all the people at the border, especially the border with Poland and trying to get out of the country. So it's sort of, it was fascinating to read, not only as a Boston tale, but also as really an immigration story. So tell us a little bit about how you sort of came at this story a couple times before you really, so tell us how you got the idea and how you finally decided to go ahead and write the book.
Yeah, many false starts over the years. Like you, I not like you because I didn't reach the New York Times, but I was a journalist for many years, newspaper reporter up and down the East Coast. And back in 1999, I was sent to Hyannisport on Cape Cod to cover the disappearance and then subsequent death of John F. Kennedy Jr. and his wife and sister-in-law.
You were at the Baltimore Sun then, right?
I was at the Baltimore Sun, that's right, yeah. So I went up there with another reporter and a photographer and covered the story, and it just triggered something in me. You know, I had never necessarily been a Kennedy person. I'm half Irish. I was raised Catholic. I went to 16 years of Catholic school. So I had the whole, spiel. But, we didn't have a bust of JFK on the mantle. Some of my classmates did. I mean, that was how I grew up. People revered the Kennedys. But there was something about covering JFK's death and seeing the scene up there. I mean, you've been at situations like this, right? Where mobs of reporters, TV, radio, newspapers, and people were just really crushed, really sad. But
I remember those press conferences out in front of the Kennedy compound, and remind us what that you tell the story in the book, but what that bartender said to you at the end of the night.
Yeah, right. So I'm roaming around town, stopping at different places. I went to the church and sat in on mass and tried to get talk to people and get quotes. And then at one point I was in this bar in town, and the bartender gives me a Jameson's, as you do when you're covering the Kennedys, I guess. And somewhere in there, either before or after I got my drink, we learned that they had found the bodies. And she broke into tears. She was just wrecked. And she said, I feel like I lost a family member. Wow. And there was something about that. I realized, like, I've always known this concept that the Kennedys are America's royal family. But I didn't experience it until that episode up at Hyannisport, and then being there with this bartender in tears, as if she'd lost a family member. So that stuck with me. And then on the way home to Baltimore, I drive through New Jersey, where I'm from, grew up in Sussex County, lived in Montclair, worked for the Bergen Record. And I came within a couple of miles that day of where my Irish immigrant grandparents are buried. And that, combined with JFK's deaths, just sort of, as I describe it, actually in the opening pages of the book, it kind of reignited my Irishness. And I spent a few years sort of diving into Irish history, Kennedy history. I traveled to Ireland. I became a naturalized Irish citizen. And along the way, next few years after that, tried to figure out, how do I write about this? How do I tell a story about the Kennedys that hasn't been told? Which is exactly why it took me so long to write this particular story, because everything's been written about the Kennedys, so many words, so many books. But in time, and we can talk about it a little, but in time I found a way in, as you referenced, the immigrant Kennedys that was the story that spoke to me. And I wanted to find out, how and why did they come to America? Who came first? What was life like for them when they got here? And in time, I sort of found my groove with that and landed on Bridget Murphy Kennedy as sort of the main character.
Right. And you had a Bridget in your own family, right?
Yeah. So the Kennedys sort of origin story is Bridget and Patrick Kennedy coming to America to start a new life for themselves. My immigrant grandparents were Bridget and Patrick, came here from Ireland to start a new life for each other. And there are some other similarities between the two couples that I found really interesting. And I thought maybe I'd write a memoir about Irishness and Catholicism and Catholic school. And none of that ever felt right until I learned a little bit more very slowly about Bridget herself and what life was like for her in America. Yeah.
So we're going to get into all that, I hope. I also covered the death of JFK Jr. And as a reporter for the Globe, there were, just a lot of Kennedy stories and Kennedy tragedies to cover. And every time there's a story about the Kennedys, you had to revisit these tragedies. And what I always remember coming up is this sense of, especially with John's plane, it was, the daredevil or the risk taking of the Kennedys. But reading your book, I was really struck by Bridget and what risks she took in the first place. So can you tell us a little about that? I mean, where does she start and how does she get here?
Yeah, and you're right. It's interesting because if you think about that as a family trait, taking risks and this sense of maybe in you're immune to death. Some of that goes back to the very beginning. Bridget Kennedy, Bridget Murphy, her maiden name, grew up in County Wexford, Southeast Ireland, small farm. As Ireland gets hit by the potato famine in the mid-1840s, she's the first one in her entire family to leave Ireland, the first one ever. And I think that
her family was not affected by the famine as much, correct?
Not as much, no. Further west it was worse in Ireland, because of agriculture and economics. Where she was, it was a small farm. They weren't well off, but they were able to kind of ride out the harsher effects of the famine, even though they lost their potato crops and were at risk of getting evicted from their farm because their farm and everyone's farm was owned by absentee English landlords at that time. It was a colony of England. And so I describe how for her staying in Ireland with or without the famine, it would have been a hard life. It was, the prospects weren't great. And so Bridget, I picture her as literally like volunteering when the potato famine hits. I'm going to go to America. I'll let you know when I'm there and let you know how it's going. Like, takes this huge risk, having never left Ireland, having never left probably, a small circumference around her farm. And she willingly takes on this daring adventure to go to Liverpool first and find a ship that will take her to America. Those crossings were dangerous and deadly and full of disease. And so for her to take that on as a 20-something Irish farm woman is remarkable to me, as is what comes later.
Yeah. So she comes to this country, and Boston, obviously, now we think of it as having this huge connection with the Irish. But at the time, there was sort of this, there was this Protestant idea in Boston that you would take care of the Irish from the famine, but you didn't want them too close, right?
You didn't want to measure neighbors necessarily.
Yeah. So tell us about that. Like so the Irish people, but the Irish women in particular who came to Boston, so here's Bridget, this risk taker. And yet when she arrives in this country, she declares herself as a servant, right? Like she knew what she was getting into.
Yeah.
What were the prospects for her in this country when she arrived?
Yeah. I mean, the prospects were, if you're lucky, you get a job as a maid.
Yeah.
And these women,
Biddies.
Yeah, biddies. A nickname or a shortcut for Bridget. And I describe how so many of these women who came over, outnumbering the men, which I found fascinating. The Irish immigrant women to America, coming to America, outnumbered their male counterparts. And they were the only sort of immigrant group where that was the case. So I think it says a lot about other Irish women coming to America at that time, like Bridget, and many of them, as you said, ending up as biddies, as servants, as maids.
Yeah.
And that was all that was really available to them. That was the big American dream, was I get to work for some well-off Protestant Brahmin sort of Boston family.
Yeah.
But she was willing to do it. And I think one of many surprises I came across doing the research was, not only was it very hard and very dangerous, and they were very poor, but they were hated. They were not wanted in Boston or anywhere else, really. There was this sense, like you said earlier, well, maybe we'll send some aid to Ireland because they're having a hard time because of this famine, but don't come here. We want you or need you here. There was, and so a lot of the book deals with the anti-immigrant attitudes in Boston and across the country, aimed at the Irish, mainly aimed at the women because they were the first ones to come over, and it was harsh. They were, I mean, discrimination is a gentle word for it.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it's just no Irish need apply, but then you get the sense that without these Irish women in particular, these the Brahmin homes in Boston wouldn't have operated.
No, they wouldn't have. They needed the Irish women. And it's interesting to read. It was interesting to read descriptions of these women in the Boston papers from the mid 1800s, and Harper's Magazine and the Atlantic, describing them as not afraid of these anti-immigrant attitudes among, well-off Bostonians. They showed up like ready to work and work hard, and a little bit full of themselves, a little bit, the
Steely.
word, steely, sassy, cocky at times, not cowed by their bosses, and in fact would say, I need Sunday off, or I need Thursday off, or they'd walk off the job if they got mad at something.
Yeah.
They weren't bowing down.
Yeah. I don't want to rush too much through her meeting her husband, but I do want to talk about what happens. So tell us quickly, she meets her husband. They come to East Boston, right? I actually had no idea that, for some reason, I sort of thought, I don't know, I think like most people, I thought Kennedy started in Brookline, right? Because that's where JFK was born. And so they go to East Boston, and she meets someone else sort of through local connections, which is the classic. Like, she meets her husband, right? Yeah. So tell us a little bit about their life and sort of East Boston. I'm fascinated by, you described the pilot and what like all these connections that they were making with Ireland through the newspaper and these ads that people would run, looking for so-and-so. It's heartbreaking in many cases.
Yeah, the Boston Pilot was fun to read. Some of so the immigrants come over, they're separated from family. Maybe they're trying to connect with some family member who came a year ago, 2 years ago. They're just trying to find a place to live, trying to find a job, trying to find a place to settle down. The Boston Pilot, the Catholic newspaper in Boston at that time, ran these ads called the Searching for Missing Friends ads. Yeah. And there were want ads, or, some version of Facebook kind of the day. And I read through so many of these. You can find them. I forget now if it's Northeastern or Boston College has it online, and you can read from 1845 and on into the 1860s, men and women saying, I'm looking for my brother, Pat. He came here 2 years ago and I haven't heard from him since. Please send information to such and such postal address. Yeah. And that's how many of these immigrants tried to connect with each other, or didn't. And in some cases, somebody would show up in Boston and then they'd find a job and they'd move out to Chicago. And then a cousin would show up looking for them in Boston, and they're nowhere to be found. It was,
what I was really struck by, in particular, who employs a lot of them, but they were able to make this community. And I was just struck by, you say at one point, I think it was, 1 in 4 Bostonians were born in Ireland? I mean, the Irish population just swelled the city to an incredible degree.
So quickly. And I think, because the first half of the book is so much about Irish immigration in general, there are a lot of stunning little factoids to me anyway. It was really the first wave of immigrants from a foreign country to America, right? Mm-hmm. Like, we think of ourselves as this quote unquote nation of immigrants, as John Kennedy would write later. And we are. But up until the Irish potato famine, it was trickles of immigrants, a little bit here and there. And it was usually connected to some hardship back in their homeland, either, economic collapse or war or some, despotism or, what have you. And you'd see a mini wave. But then when the Irish came, they came by the tens of thousands. Yeah. And over time, hundreds of thousands came to America. And so it was overwhelming to some of these cities to deal with this influx of these newcomers. And many of them were coming from farms or, raised rural, and they end up in these cities, Boston, New York, Baltimore, New Orleans, and they didn't want to leave the cities. Back to the Boston Pilot, I describe how the Boston Pilot would plead with incoming Irish and say, move west, get out of Boston. You're going to die here, literally. Yeah. There's disease, there's not enough jobs, there's not enough places to live. Go out to the Midwest and find a farm job. And a lot of these immigrants, again, mostly women, said, no, I'm going to stay here. I'm putting my, stake in the ground. This is where I live and where I'm going to work. A fascinating period of time.
Yeah. Okay. So tell us how she meets Patrick, and who's Patrick?
Yeah. So Patrick Kennedy came also from County Wexford, grew up also on a small farm, with his family, lived in the same cottage that generations before him lived in. What I found interesting about Patrick, though, is that he, unlike his siblings and others from that era, he worked on the farm, but then at some point in his late teens into his early 20s, decided to do something else and found a job in the nearest town making barrels, whiskey and beer barrels. He became a cooper, a barrel maker. So he had a little bit of a skill and a little bit of a leg up when he gets to Boston. But he was also the first in his family to leave Ireland, gets to Boston, ends up in East Boston working at a cooperage. It's hard to say how exactly they met, probably through family members or the Catholic Church. And they meet and they marry in 1849, and they end up in, as you said, East Boston, which I find it to be a remarkable community then and now.
Yeah.
And they start a life for themselves into the 1850s. Lose their first son, John F. Kennedy. So they experience hardship early on, not just the discrimination that they face, but economic troubles and disease and death.
Yeah. And then on November 22nd, which is going to become an amazingly unfortunate day in the history of the Kennedy family, what happens to Patrick?
Patrick dies of consumption or tuberculosis, but it was called at that time consumption. That date is fascinating to me because later we'll learn that JFK's other great-grandfather also dies on November 22nd. It's my son's birthday. So it's always been an interesting date to me. Yeah. Born in Summit, New Jersey, right down the road from Montclair. But Patrick is dead, and Bridget is left with her next born son, Patrick Joseph, who they call PJ, 10 months old, in her arms, and 3 daughters. And takes Patrick to the grave and is left alone just 10 years after they made it to America. And they thought they were starting this new life together. And now Patrick's gone and she's all by herself.
And she can't bury him in East Boston. In fact, she can't bury him anywhere in the city of Boston because she has to go to Cambridge across, what is it? She has to cross 2 rivers? To the harbor.
Cross from East Boston into Boston, then from Boston.
Charles. So it's incredible. So she buries him in Cambridge because you can't bury Irish in Boston anymore because the cemeteries are too crowded or they're not allowed. And then again, her remarkable risk taking. She initially, I guess, goes back to work as a maid, but then she opens a store, which is incredible. It sounds from the book like maybe there were a lot of women who were starting essentially the bodegas of their day, right?
Trying to, back to how we talked about these women taking the jobs that were available to them when they showed up, mostly maid, just getting their foot in the door, getting established, making some money, starting a family. And as soon as they could, they tried to do more. It's a remarkable period of sort of slow and not easy, but empowerment as these women sort of move inch by inch, foot by foot up the ladder. Yeah. In Bridget's case, she works as a maid in a Boston home. She works at a hotel as a servant cleaner. Yeah. Then she works as a hairdresser at a department store in downtown Boston. Jordan Marsh, the famous Boston department store. I think it's now owned by Macy's. Yeah. But there she kind of learns more about Boston, about business, about customers, about commerce, all these things that in time inspire her somehow to decide, okay, I can do this. And she opens her small shop in East Boston. And I think it's remarkable too that she decides East Boston is my home. Yeah. Not Boston. This is where I started. This is where my husband died. This is where my kids were born. I'm going to stay in East Boston and make something of it and do the best I can. And she opens this small, scrappy little business. And, I've been to East Boston many times since, and you see these businesses there today, little bodegas, little Latin American markets, Central American markets owned by, incoming immigrants in many cases doing the same thing, trying to get started. So her tenacity to do that at a time when women just didn't open businesses, especially widowed Irish immigrant women.
Right. The widow Kennedy. Yeah. So she has, she loses one child, and then she has, is it 2 daughters and then PJ? Where does PJ come in? PJ comes in, and he is JFK's he's JFK's grandfather, right? He's Joseph Kennedy's father.
Exactly.
Okay, right.
Yeah.
Okay, so PJ is the youngest. He's not like a great student. He's not particularly ambitious to start, but he ends up he's got something about his personality. He ends up being pretty successful in a particular way. Tell us about him?
Yeah, very specific way. And, you can't help but argue that it comes from his mother sort of showing him the way. But yeah, he was a troublemaker as a kid. He didn't go to school very much. He spent a little time at this juvenile detention center on Deer Island.
Deer Island, right.
Yeah. Where I described they stuck all the bad stuff, the hardcore criminals, the truants. He was probably just skipping school or doing something, small scale, but he ends up with all these hardcore criminals for a period of time. And then, as you said, little by little kind of finds his way. He works as a longshoreman, a grunt, hauling cargo on and off the ships. East Boston was a very bustling shipbuilding and shipping hub. And so he found work doing that. It wasn't his calling. And then at some point, sort of just as he's approaching 20, or reaches like 2021, he starts his own business, just like his mother did. He buys a saloon, rundown saloon in South Boston with a sort of a checkered past. Somebody had just killed himself in the basement of this saloon shortly before PJ bought it. And that's his entry into not just business, but it's this sort of tipping point into a new life for himself, which will slowly lead him into politics, which is sort of the beginning of the Kennedy family in politics.
Right. And he wasn't a drinker himself, right? Like you found that everyone said he was a teetotaler?
Yeah, apparently everything I've been able to find, he rarely drank anything, maybe on special occasions he would have like half a glass of beer. And I think his mother was the same based on what I've been able to find. So he was, not the cliched Irish, tossing back drinks. He was, and, I think he was careful. I think he got to a point in his life where he started to pay attention, and he would later tell his son Joe and grandkids, don't make mistakes, be careful. Because he knew there were all these forces aligned against them, whether it's immigrants or Irish or Catholics. There are these tripwires everywhere in Boston. He was very careful to sort of walk a fine line and keep his nose clean. And late in life, I have these quotes in the book from other politicians and observers saying, it's amazing that this guy who was in the liquor business in Boston politics during a really rough period of time, never got in trouble, never, accused of corruption or breaking the law. He stayed sort of straight until the end. So I think he was a really fascinating character and a hard worker and very sort of committed to what he was trying to do.
But I was struck by, you described that I don't know if you call it the liquor industry or maybe saloon owners, but it seems like there's a lot of sort of liquor politics crossover. How was that? Was that just how people got to know each other through these saloons, and you built your base that way?
For the Irish, it was.
Yeah.
And I found that to be pretty fascinating. PJ, so he starts his first saloon in the late 1870s, opens a couple more into the 1880s, and is very successful. Retail shop, a bar here, a bar there, because that was how they decided they could make their way into business. That whole sort of world introduced him to other successful liquor dealers and saloon keepers, and many of them were little by little finding their way into politics. At that time, sort of mid 1880s, Boston was dominated and had been for many, many years by Republicans, by old school families, dating back to the colonists. I mean, it was a very entrenched, familial sort of political system. And now you've got these sort of moving up the economic ladder Irish who are deciding, well, we want to get into politics too. We feel like we've been, oppressed in many ways. The schools, there were certain laws against us. There were, the rise of the nativist party that preceded PJ trying to pass laws that prevented Irish from being able to vote or hold public office or become citizens. And so the Irish, once they find this little bit of power and agency, decide, all right, we want to get into politics too. But it took a while. And And PJ was just at the forefront of that.
Yeah.
In the 1880s, he runs for the state house, runs for a state representative for Massachusetts in 1885, just after Boston elects its first ever Irish Catholic mayor. So it's just the very beginning of the Irish democratic politics of that city.
Right. Like by the time I was in Boston in the 90s, it was like only Irish need apply.
Exactly. Right.
But you talk about him as though he's like, again, yes, unambitious, but also not a particularly gifted speech maker. What was his political gift? Was it just kind of empire building, or then he gets out of the way, right? He decides he sort of prefers to be behind the scenes, but he does have quite a long career, as the leading man, right?
Yeah. I think his character is fascinating to me because I describe him alongside JFK's other grandfather, Honey Fitz, John F. Fitzgerald, and they were contemporaries. They grew up very much the same. Both firstborn, both sons of Irish immigrant grocers. Both moved their way up in the sort of the grassroots politics of the day. But Honey Fitz is so well known as being bombastic and great at giving speeches and inspiring. And, he'd sing Sweet Adeline at a bar and do a little Irish jig. And PJ was just much more reserved. But what I think his strength is that he really just cared about helping his people. His constituents, neighbors,
plugging away and doing the work
doing the hard work. He started out as literally like a community organizer, going door to door, knocking on people's doors, telling them who to vote for. And then once he becomes an elected politician, he truly gives back. And I think you see this later in the Kennedy family, this sense of we're fortunate. We have to do something in return. And PJ really took that to heart. And I found a lot of remarkable sort of commentary, including from Honey Fitz, saying up until the end, he just cared about people. He wanted to help. Yeah. One of the things I relied on for research was they're called the PJ Kennedy papers at the JFK library, the Presidential Library and Archives. Yeah. And these are letters that were written by him late 1880s into the early 1900s, late 1800s into the early 1900s. And almost all of them are him trying to help somebody else, writing to a city official or an employer or a lawyer or someone in a position of power saying, hey, I just learned about so-and-so. Can we help them? Can we, find a job for this person? Or I think this person would be a good candidate for this office. Can we get behind them? So he was just always thinking about how do we help each other and how do we get ahead?
And he still had a bit of an eye to Ireland too, right? And sort of helping people who were coming, but also he was looking back toward where his mother had come from as well, right?
Yeah, I think he was. And I think he learned at some point that everything that I'm experiencing here in America, a lot of the success I've been able to, the things I've been able to achieve really tie back to the homeland and this sort of scrappy fight, in their case in Ireland, for independence, for freedom, and so I think he had this sense of, it's not just tenacity, it's this righteousness, right? That I think you see in later Kennedys as well. He saw the homeland that his parents came from and how they were kept down by their colonizers. Yeah. And in America, he developed this sense that we can help here, we can help in Ireland. He and his mother both sent money back to Ireland to help family members, pay back rent to a landlord who was trying to evict them. So he just had this he had a deep sense of generosity and compassion. And a sense of service. I'm here to do what I can to help. And he got rich along the way.
Right. Doesn't hurt. And he also married he married a woman not unlike his mother, right? Strong, sort of steely type. I mean, that was the theme that I kept thinking in the book was, oh yeah, we see this again. Yeah, it is a theme, a thread, right? He marries Mary Augusta Hickey, daughter of another Irish immigrant couple. And I think there was a really interesting connection between them. I can't say that she reminded him of his mother, who knows,
but she had similar traits. She was very devout. She was stern in some ways. I described how PJ was sort of like, let's do this right. Don't make any mistakes. And I think Mary Hickey was very much that way too. And she became very much his partner in his political ascent and in his businesses too, in the liquor business. She was literally on some of the liquor license applications for his pubs. Her name was on there too.
And they have Joe and of course Joseph P. Kennedy. So they decide, so finally it's not going to be Patrick Joseph anymore. It's going to be Joseph Patrick.
Right. And that was Mary's idea. She said, no more Patricks in this house.
So, and he, of course, marries Rose, who's another, strong Kennedy woman.
Yeah.
Tell us a bit about Joe and sort of his relationship with his father and how, it's really an incredible, like by the time I'm reading and by the time Bridget dies, she's 67 and I'm thinking, oh my God, she must be like 85 because she's just lived an incredibly full life. But it's also an incredible arc from Bridget, 20 something, leaving Ireland, having, widowed mother of 6 kids, I can't remember. And
4.
And suddenly Joseph P. is at Harvard and he becomes an ambassador. That's a remarkable arc in that sort of span.
Unbelievable to me. And I felt like most people know something about Joe Kennedy, the father with Rose of those 9 kids who we think of as Camelot. But the beginnings of Joe's life, for example, because we're talking about him and his relationship with PJ, I find that to be fascinating too, because here's PJ who, he's just one generation past the worst of the potato famine. And suddenly it seems on paper, like you and I looking backwards, he's rich. He's a hugely successful politician locally, but very influential. He's part of this board of strategy that meets in back rooms and decides who's going to be the next candidate or who gets certain city jobs. And he's co-owner in a bank. He's co-owner in a coal company. He's involved in real estate. All these things, like all of a sudden. And so Joe sees this growing up. Joe was born to privilege. Joe,
he was born on third base.
From third base, right? And there were times later where Joe would describe his hard upbringing and his poor childhood, and maybe there was a moment of that before he was aware of it. But really, his conscious years, he was a child of great privilege who was, with his father's help, was able to go to Harvard. Which was rare for an Irish kid, second generation Irish. But the differences between those two men are fascinating to me. You see Joe, as he comes of age, interested in his father's bank, but not his father's politics.
Right.
He's an Irish Democrat, but he didn't want to run for elected office. I think he didn't necessarily want to help people the way his father did.
But he wanted to be close to power, right? Like he did.
Yeah. And I think he saw this is the route to power, right? Through wealth, which he became very wealthy very fast, which was amazing to me. But he didn't want to run for office and be the person who was greeting people at the door, knocking. He would describe his father,
I don't want to forget this part. The fact that when he and Rose marry, so it's these, they're the scions of these 2 political giants in Boston. Their wedding is on the front page of the Boston Globe. That's pretty astonishing, right?
Isn't it?
So I worked at the Boston Globe when John and Carolyn got married, and they were on the front page of the Boston Globe. There weren't a lot of political marriages that were ending up there. That's quite something. 1914,
they weren't the Kennedys yet. The Kennedys, like we know them. And yet their parents, Rose's father, John, and Joe's father, PJ, they were so well known in Boston by that time that it was front page news, because it was this joining together of these 2 extremely powerful families. And
did Joe make his money initially through the bank or through the liquor? Where did it start?
Initially through the bank. And it was fun to explore Joe's sort of trajectory. He gets out of Harvard. He gets a job working as a state bank inspector, traveling throughout Massachusetts, visiting banks. So he does learn the business, but he's not, in a position of power yet. Then his father kind of calls him in and says, okay, we've got this situation at my bank. I'd like you to take care of this. There was a sort of a hostile takeover attempt, and PJ, Joe's father, says, we need to raise some money. Why don't you call some of your rich Harvard buddies and others that you've met in your travels around the state as a banking inspector and see if we can save my bank. It wasn't just his, it was him and other investors from East Boston. And Joe does. So he steps up and does a great job. And his father rewards him with the presidency of that bank in East Boston. What I got a kick out of was reading some of the headlines at that time, and then in other biographies of Joe Kennedy or the family, youngest bank president in America. Well, it was Daddy's bank.
Yeah, right.
But it
was nothing to do with East Boston, right? Like, he doesn't stay in East Boston.
No, I think he wanted to get out. I think he wanted to get out of East Boston, and then in time out of Boston entirely. Wow. I think he felt it was provincial. I mean, he was so ambitious, right? We know this about Joe Kennedy. And he learned what he needed to learn from Harvard, from his father-in-law, and knew I'm out of here. I'm going to New York. I'm going to LA. I'm going to get involved in, stocks and trading and then filmmaking and all. I mean, his ascent is just remarkable. But I think Boston was a small town to him, and he was happy to get out.
Right. So we're going to ask questions soon. So if people have questions, please enter them in I believe it's on the chat. You can ask, there it is, ask a question right there. But yeah, so tell us, so Joe and Rose end up going to New York, and then they go to, I guess, the Court of St. James initially, right? Or is that their? Yeah,
at some point, I guess I'm not, because I don't delve too deeply into Joe's life and career, but yes, he does. He has a connection and a relationship with Roosevelt that dates back to World War I, and then he remarkably, Oh, you had asked it earlier. Let me just touch on this real quickly. Yeah. The liquor piece. Yeah. PJ's liquor, he was involved in liquor up until Prohibition hit. When he was forced to, took all his liquor stocks and put it in the basement of his house. And Joe helped him move these bottles. Yeah. So into the 1920s, later, Joe got credit for being a bootlegger, which I don't think he was. I think he was able to snag some bottles from his father, PJ. At times, and then maybe sell them or give them as gifts. But I don't believe he was a bootlegger per se. He did get involved in the liquor business later after Prohibition ended, and was, again, a big success in that as well. But I think there was a little bit of mythology there about Joe Kennedy, the bootlegger. But it does speak to liquor being a through line through the first generations of the Kennedys in America.
Absolutely, yes. Yeah. Okay, so one of the questions here is, I'm halfway through the book and want to ask about the photo of Cotter and Kennedy's business in Boston. Our local Montclair resident, James Cotter, was fascinated by the family name when I showed him. Can you say more about that? So that was the liquor business? I can't remember. It's Crossing, is that right? I can't remember. Yeah,
that was one of PJ's bigger, more successful. It was a pub and a retail liquor shop. It was near Haymarket Square, which
North End, right?
Yeah, North End, and then the original Haymarket Square. You probably know this better than I do. Kate, got demolished, and now there's sort of, I don't think it's there anymore. I think actually, but I never quite figured this out. I think the location where PJ's bar was, Cotter and Kennedy, is now buried under the Rose Fitzgerald
Kennedy Greenway, right?
Yeah, the Greenway.
Right. So there was the elevated highway that went through, and then the Big Dig, which was the country's largest public works program, put all that underground, and it's now the Rose Kennedy Greenway on top. Yeah.
And somewhere up there was Cotter and Kennedy, one of PJ's most successful saloons and liquor businesses, but he owned others. There's one that lasted for decades called Kennedy and Quigley in East Boston. But Cotter, I mentioned Cotter in the book. J.J. Cotter and J.J. Quigley were two of PJ's partners in the liquor business.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about researching the book. You did a lot you mentioned the JFK Museum. How much work did you have to do in Ireland, and how the pilot seems like it must have been a goldmine for you, just reading about Irish life in Boston. But was it you really make great efforts to sort of figure out even like what boat they came across on, like how it's hard to find a Bridget Murphy, isn't it?
It is.
Irish
Given it was, one of the more popular names in Ireland, it was tricky. Yeah, that I think, the research was a challenge for sure. I've described it before as sort of cracking a mystery, and I don't think it fully did. I don't think anyone could, just because this happened so long ago, and these are Kennedys before they were capital K Kennedys. These were immigrant Kennedys, so they didn't leave behind much of a trail. And then, as you said, there's this complication of both Patrick and Bridget being the most common names at that time. And so figuring out through all of my genealogical research and newspaper research, is that really my Bridget? Is this really my Patrick on this ship? And so I try to be honest about that in the book, because I don't want to pretend to know things I don't know, and instead sort of describe, in the case of the coffin ships that they came across on, this is what it would have been like. Bridget was probably on this ship. Gotcha.
Bridget's story in particular, because you're doing is telling us what it's like for, a young Irish woman to come over. So I felt like you described it really well. Good. Thank you for that answer. He says on Connor. Okay.
You're welcome, Bob.
And tell us, doing reporting more recently, like how much, you said that you did reach out to, the current generation Kennedy members who are still alive. How much did they know, and how much were you telling them in the end about their own ancestors? Yeah,
that was interesting, and kind of revealing. I reached out to as many Kennedy family members as I could find, or who were willing to take my phone call or email or letter. And some of them were very gracious and appreciative of this sort of effort to learn more about this part of the story. And most of them sort of word for word, like, I don't know, they just don't know that part of their family history, like many of us probably don't. But with the Kennedys, I guess my hope was somebody's got a stash of something somewhere, right? Like there's something buried there. And there were a couple family members. There's one member of the extended family, Carrie McCarthy, who many years ago, she was descended from one of PJ's sisters. And many years ago put together some information based on something that her mother wrote that sort of was her attempt to bring PJ to life. And that was helpful. But other family members, Rory Kennedy, like, sounds great. Good luck. I don't know, and I describe, I don't know if it's in the book or not, but I made a brief connection with Maria Shriver, and she wrote a nice note saying, I look forward to reading your book, and I hope I learn more about my family. Yeah. Wow. I just don't know. Yeah. And as you looked at the earliest Kennedys, the first Kennedys, you call them in the book, were there other traits that I mentioned sort of the risk-taking, the boldness. Were there other traits that you could see traced down? You talk a little bit about, Bobby's civil rights work and Teddy's sort of long legislative career. Were there any threads that you felt you could see from Bridget or PJ or Patrick? Yeah. That's sort of a risky thing for an author to sort of make these, but I did feel like there are these through lines. Like you see Bridget taking the risk early on. You see her son taking these risks, as a businessman and as a politician. And then you see Joe Kennedy taking huge risks in business. And I think that trickles all the way down. But I think it's not just risk taking for the sake of taking a risk. It's not just being reckless. I think a lot of people look at the death of JFK Jr. and say, well, he was just wasn't being careful. He shouldn't have been flying. And, maybe there's truth to that, but I think there's this other sensibility throughout the family of trying to do something big, trying to do something that matters, trying to be helpful. And I think that piece of it, I find it to be fairly consistent. And I think that does go back to Bridget, having this grocery store in a poor immigrant neighborhood, trying to help her neighbors, and we didn't talk about it, but she ended up owning the building above her grocery store,
right.
and rented out the apartments to incoming immigrants, two of whom became her sons-in-law.
Yeah.
And then you see PJ later loaning money to people and trying to help them get jobs. And there are a number of Joe Kennedy's sons and daughters who later talked about this sense of giving back that they were instilled with.
Yeah.
But there's also this resiliency and tenacity, this ability to recover from hardship. We've seen that family get hit time and time again with just tragedy after tragedy, and they, for the most part, bounce back. And I think these are remarkable traits.
Yeah. I also, what's interesting to me too, I loved the, I guess it's after PJ retires from politics and he goes back to, Ireland, his wife dies, right? And he goes to Ireland with his daughters, who I gather never married, or they remained living at home with him?
They did. They married late, which was sort of common among Irish women. They stayed single for a long time, tried to work as much as they could, and then married later than some other. But
they go to Ireland, and then he sort of, it sounds like he kind of turns toward learning more about where his mother came from. And then there is that part about, of course, JFK going back to Ireland and giving a speech about where his family had come from, his grandparents came from, great-grandparents came from. And there is sort of like, there's a turning back toward the homeland, right? Like that's sort of, tell us about PJ. PJ got more interested in that, certainly.
I think he did. It took him time to get back there and actually meet with family members and visit his father's farm. I think it's unclear what happened to Bridget's family farm. I went a number of years ago to the location where it was, and it's just a pile of stones and a bunch of grass. So that farm didn't last. But on PJ's father's side, Joe's grandfather's side, Patrick, the farm is still in the family. It's still, you see these old buildings that date back to the 1800s, still there. And I think PJ developed sort of a renewed appreciation for where he came from. And then you see it skip Joe, because Joe didn't want to be identified as Irish American or Irish. He was American, and he wanted to put sort of the immigrant experience or his connections to that immigrant experience behind. Which I guess makes sense in some way, but I find it interesting then other family members, and in the book I focus on JFK, picking up this interest in Irish history and where they came from, and JFK visiting Ireland a number of times, first when he was a congressman in 1947, and then, as you said, he goes back in 1963, just months before he's killed, and goes to New Ross, the little town just north of where his father came from, and his great-grandfather, and gives a shout out to his great-grandfather, the barrel maker, which I think is sweet, and it's a great speech, and sort of an important point in the history of JFK and his Irish connections. But I also look back and think, well, he didn't mention Bridget. Why is that?
Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. I was struck, though, when I read the story, when you read about the immigrant experience, I guess it always, looking back, it always strikes me from our vantage point that John F. Kennedy had to get up and say, I won't be directed by the Vatican, right? My politics are, I'm American, I'm not a Catholic. But it's really, you really put it in such great context. But this is, as I said, are you there?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. This is very much, as I said at the beginning, sort of like a story about immigration. And how do you talk about how when you finally came back to this book in the end, you were thinking also it was sort of at the time when people were talking about build the wall. Can you tell us how you sort of came to think about immigration from writing this book?
Yeah, hopefully that theme stands up throughout the book, because I wanted it to be the thing that connects the Kennedy story to today. To make this subtle argument that what they were up against, what Bridget was up against in the 1800s, and her husband was up against, this sense of, we don't want you here, send them back. They're coming here to bring their religion and their crime and all these things at times word for word what we hear in recent years. And so I wanted to explore what does it mean to be an immigrant in this country? We think of the Kennedys as, the epitome of American sort of success politically and in other ways, and wealth and style and all these things. But they started as poor immigrants too, like
Right.
many of us and our families did. And so I think hopefully it pays homage to that. But I think it's interesting that the Kennedy family did recognize that. John F. Kennedy, for example, writes A Nation of Immigrants, and describes, not just the Irish immigrant experience, but the experience of other immigrant groups coming to this country and running into the same nonsense over and over and over again. And how I think, he recognized that it is our strength, but it's our strength despite the best efforts of its opponents.
Right. Right. As I said, when I guess with the exception of Joe, right? Joe's the one who wants to forget about being an immigrant.
Right.
But yeah, the connection between just the generations is fascinating, and how things change so quickly. So I'm trying to think, Margot, are we almost, I'm just trying to see if we have any other questions here.
Am I allowed to ask you a question, Kate?
Yeah, sure.
What's your new book about? Or forthcoming book?
My forthcoming book is about, it's about a really cool group of women scientists at MIT. It's actually a story that it's based on a story I did when I was at the Globe. But these are a group of women who, for the most part, got hired at the top levels of academic science in the early 70s, when there was a big push on for affirmative action. And they thought, okay, the women's rights movement, equal pay, like, we've got this. It's, we won't face any discrimination. And they work for 20 years thinking that's going to be the case, and then finally in the 90s they wake up and they look and they see how hard they've worked, and they still have less lab space and are earning less than all the men, and the men have gone on to these fantastic careers, and they actually end up they get together slowly one by one, and each of them has kind of a feminist awakening. But in the late 90s, they get together and they get MIT to admit that it's discriminating against them. So it's the story of these women, each one of their careers, and then how they come together at the end.
Cool.
Yeah.
Awesome.
It's a really interesting group of women. So yeah. So are you? Oh, there's Margot.
Hi. Don't want to interrupt. I know, but this has been an incredible conversation. Thank you both so much. And I think, Neal, you did bring, it's not just the story of an amazing family. I mean, whether you love to hate them or love them, the Kennedys are an amazing family. And you brought the origin story to us, and the story of immigration.
Yes.
I mean, it's every family started some way. And you did a beautiful job in that. And for both of you, I really appreciate the time that you've given us this evening, and to have this conversation. You guys donate your time to us, and I think the only way we can thank you is by buying your book.
The green button.
Green button at the bottom. And again, Neal came and signed the book, so it's really a special gift and a special read. So the buy button is going to remain live after the talk. And if you missed any of our conversation tonight, you can just rewind once we're finished, and you can enjoy Neal and Kate all over again. But thank you both so much.
Thank you, Neal.
Kate, thanks for the conversation. It was so great to speak with you. And Margot, thanks for all the support at the bookstore.
Anytime.
Loved it.